Ani, Natalie King, Nadijnakaz, Timiskaming First Nation, and Donjaba, Makwa Nidodem. Hi everyone, my name is Natalie King. I am from Timiskaming First Nation. I currently sit on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Métis Nation. I am an interdisciplinary queer Indigenous artist. I'm Algonquin and Anishinaabe. And my practice is mainly focused on queer Indigenous livelihoods. It's an interdisciplinary practice, so I work in the means of like video, painting, installation, curation, and arts administration. I mean, I guess a good way of starting it would be talking about sort of my creative process as an artist. I think from the basis of what I do, I'm really focused in on, storytelling. So for me, it starts off with what do I want to convey to the audience? What do I want to talk about? What issues seem most consequential to me in my community? And how am I sort of portraying those ideas onto the canvas? I've sort of gone through different iterations of my practice, and so for me the medium is really like the starting point. So I think about what medium is the best way to tell this story? How am I getting this point across? For this show I've chosen painting because to me there's an immediacy to painting that I really love. There's a way that I go about my practice that to me is really holistic, and I think centering my own well-being and mental health is sort of what comes first. And then I sort of think about, what gives me joy, what makes me feel happy, how do I derive pleasure? And so I start with sort of these ideas of sketches, drawings, and then, sometimes I jump right in and I, go from a sketch to a painting instantly. And then sometimes it takes a lot of, thinking through, concept to creation. So after that drawing is done, I'll usually do different layers of paint, and then I sort of incorporate aerosol paint into my work. So I use a lot of spray paint. And I think for me, it's a way of sort of bridging the gap between, I guess I think in the context of like Canadian Western sort of colonial perspectives on like what the perception of Indigenous art is. I think my job, or what I find my role being, is challenging those expectations. And so within that, I think using these materials, these paintings are telling a story about, what does this world look like? What were our ancestors doing? How are they acting together? How are we doing that now as future ancestors? And what are we leaving behind? Like, what stories are we telling? And for me, growing up, it was really scarce to find any sort of queer Anishinaabe, Algonquin representations about two-spirit identity. And so for me, it was like, I made this painting in like 2020 or 2019 called Miskay Ojibwe. And for me, that was like, I think it was like the aha moment where I was like, this is what I wanted to see. So it's also sort of about connecting with that like inner child almost too, when we're thinking about our future generations and sort of like, what do we want them to see? How is the world changing? How is it not changed? And how are these visual representations sort of supporting this idea of the future, our future livelihoods, our future explorations, our thoughts, our ideas? So yeah. I think for me, it's about embracing queer Indigenous livelihood. In my work, I'm seeking to challenge or reshape societal norms as they're tied to the way that folks view queer, trans, Indigenous people. I think that it's sort of, for me, about liberating ourselves from those colonial constraints, and maybe the idea of reclaiming culture, identity, language, visual identity are sort of central themes in my work, I would say, yeah. I sort of see my work as a complete resistance to that. I think that naturally, if you're talking to an Indigenous artist, it's always, our perspectives have not been, the main discourse in this country on Turtle Island for 150 years, and the effects of colonization that are ever present and ongoing, I think inform my practice. I think first and foremost, I think that my work redefines power as a sort of an idea of self-determination. In an Algonquin, Anishinaabe perspective, we don't see power as sort of a means of control or gain. It's about the interconnectedness of community and being a steward of your community, of the land, recognizing an interconnectedness between all living beings, being present and having a sort of consensus-based decision-making process that not only benefits the individuals, but also benefits the entire community. So for me, I sort of always am thinking of bringing that that worldview is just sort of embedded into my work. It's not separate from it. It's an extension of that, I would say. Yeah. I guess I'm going to start with, there's a painting in the show called Flourishing in Triumphant Futures. And for me, it's a painting, it's a 36 by 48 painting that incorporates, spray paint. And there's sort of, I guess a bunch of different faces. And so for me, I was thinking about this idea of power as a shared collective experience. I'm thinking about power as sort of a shared responsibility or a shared duty. And so thinking about sort of these faces and these bodies as they are powerful when they're together. They're powerful when they can share space with one another. They're powerful when they can tell each other stories. And so for me, it was about having that there. And, I think also with being a queer Indigenous artist, there's often this sort of sentiment of what are you going to teach the world? Or what are you going to share? Or how are you going to educate? And I think for me, I know we've had conversations about this before, but it's not necessarily just about that. The work is primarily for an Indigenous viewer, and it's also about this idea of, what does a self-determined future look like, and how are we centering our stories in these conversations? And, this idea of authority and control being tied to power isn't necessarily something that I have ever identified with. I just can't, you know what I mean? I have never in my life been afforded that option. And so it's supposed to be sort of a signal to maybe a gateway or some kind of visual aid to sort of signify this transition or this future, or this imagined future. I feel like my commitment to my community is why I do what I do as an artist. In the sort of ways that I engage with the more than human world through my art is through the reciprocity and interconnectedness of all of our voices. I think acknowledging the importance of strength and the collective through various spheres of existence is really important to me. So not only, you know, talking about queer Indigenous bodies, who we are as humans, but also our responsibility to the land and each other and the environment is something that I feel like is coming up again and again in my practice as well. And the ways that I support my communities, you know, I try to be like a good sister, a good auntie, a good daughter. I try to show up for like my cousins and my friends. And I also think just being an arts worker, you know, there's so much mentorship and, you know, ways that I work in my life, you know, not just as an artist, but like my day job is to support emerging artists, is to amplify the voices of folks who are marginalized and who exist on the margins. And so creating spaces and opportunities, creating ways that we can show our work to the world is really important to me. And I think that's another way. I don't necessarily see it as like separate. It's sort of more like an extension of the things that I feel like I'm already doing. And also something that I'm super excited about is I just finished a fellowship at GalleryTPW, and one of the things that they asked was like, what do you want to do with your time with us? And I was like, for me, like I moved to the city in 2015. I didn't know anybody, I didn't have a lot of connections, and it was hard to sort of find that community that I was really looking for. And so for me, it was like, again, it's that way of like thinking about all of the things that you've benefited from in your practice and who supported you and who helped you. And in that cyclical way of thinking about, well, I've been able to do all of these amazing things. How do I extend that further and think about, you know, the people that are coming after us? And so we're creating a resource, or I'm creating a resource for queer, Indigenous, trans, and two-spirit people. It'll basically be like a website that's open for like a year, and it features interviews with all kinds of different queer and Indigenous artists who have been a part of like the city of Toronto in some way. Just offering advice and like demystifying like what it means to do this job, like this like beautiful, wonderful, confusing journey that we're all on. And so that to me was like another way of doing that and supporting my community, and I hope that people like it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, I think about when we're talking about power too, it's like, I think once you become somewhat known for what you do as an artist, there's that thing where you're afforded so many amazing opportunities that are super exciting that, but then can also sort of have you at this place of, you know, I work full time as an arts administrator, but I also do all of these projects. And so for me, it's like, how am I preventing burnout? How am I preventing like the stress building up, managing multiple deadlines, you know, not even just to talk about like the physical production and creation of the work. And so for me, it has to start from a place of like well-being. So for me, like, it looks like, you know, taking care of myself. And that to me looks like, you know, I've been really lucky in the sense that when my studio moved, instead of finding another space in the city, I actually moved a part of it to like a section of my parents' house in East Gwillimbury, just like a little up north. And for me, that was like kind of life-changing in the way that it made my practice so much more like holistic, in the sense that like, you know, in between painting, you know, like my dad's just outside and we can talk, and like, you know, my sister's there, and like my sister does like so much amazing beadwork. And so there's these conversations that are happening between us and like what we're making. And like, I guess what I mean to say is like, when you're making work outside of that, you know, going to your studio, I was in the city, so everybody's, you know, and a lot of my family are up north. And so I was sort of removed from it. And that was also happening during the pandemic. So I had gotten this studio and then I was there for 3 years, lost the studio, and sort of have moved it back there. And what it's done for my practice is like, honestly, it's like reaffirming why I do what I do, and also creating a space where I can go, I'm just gonna go outside. I'm gonna walk around, I'm gonna think, I'm gonna slow the process down a little bit. I'm not gonna be worried, I'm trying not to be worried about all of these other things that I have in the back of my head that I have to do. And so, you know, it gives you opportunities to like, yeah, smudge, sit, think, talk to your family, you know, eat together. Like, you know, there were things that I think took for granted. And now it's like, it feels like such a wonderful like blessing that I'm able to do this now. And that I get to share that with them because they've always been such a big part of that process for me. But yeah.